So let me talk a little bit about how I created these runes that spin around these rocks. And as you can see, there's particles here as well. All I did inside my blueprint is went to add. I added a Niagara particle system component, and then I added this Niagara system, which is right here, and it's called spinning runes. And I'm going to show you how I made that. So inside here, I'm going to go through each part one step at a time. The first thing I did is made some just simple blue particles, and they're spawning as a torus. You can see my values here. This is where the torus is in the scene, and you can't see it. These particles are just spawning on top of this invisible torus. And I'm spawning about 10 of these particles a time. They're spawning infinitely, and their lifetime minimum is 5 and their max is 8. And there's a little bit of size variation between 2 and 5, so some of these particles are a bit bigger than others. And there's some drag, and then particle scale sprite size, they start out at nothing, they get up to about 1, get to 0.8 towards the end, and then at the end of their life cycle at 1, they're basically at 0, so like that. Okay, and what's causing this movement because they're not just staying still, they're on the torus that they're spawning from, they're rotating around, and that's all due to vortex velocity. I have negative 250, 2,500 vortex velocity on the z-axis. So if I turn this off, you can see what happens. Now they're not staying put at all, nothing's holding them together, they're just going every which way due to this curl noise force. So if I turn that back on, they're rotating around because they're all being pulled by this velocity of the vortex. Remember, particle update is stuff that's happening after they spawn, so the entire time that they live, they are affected by this vortex velocity. Anything inside of the particle update is happening after they spawn, and then particle spawn is exactly when. So if you wanted to have a different velocity that only happens at the beginning, you'd put that under particle spawn. And then I have some the curl noise force, just to give a little bit of variety here, so they're not all happening uniformly. They're kind of bobbing up and down a little bit. Some of them are moving a little bit differently than others, just to add some variation. The next is basically the same thing, except you can look at the shape location of my torus, and the shape location of my torus is a little bit different. They're all down here at the bottom. And again, the shape of this and how everything's moving is all due to this vortex velocity. So if you turn this off, all going haywire. All the settings are the same as this one. You can just, if you make this, just copy and paste it because the color is the same, the sprite scale size is the same, everything's the same on this, except the only difference is we have a point attraction force, meaning it's just going to pull it in a little bit. Might not necessarily need that. Some of these particles are fading off, they're going outside the circle, and I want to keep them in here, so I'm just going to keep that on. It'll keep any of these from getting it'll keep some of these from getting too far out of line. Next, let's talk about the runes. These are randomly spawning, and I have 3 of them, 3 different runes here. So if I turn this on, you can see what's happening. They're slowly lighting up, and if you notice, they're turning with and by the normals of an invisible torus. So many times, if you see effects, the problem that they have is that they'll be always facing the camera. You'll be looking at it and this would face me all the time. But as you can see, some of these aren't facing me. They're going around and they're turning based on the normals of a torus. So they're not always facing the camera. If I rotate around it, it's staying rotated that way, if that makes sense. So again, same kind of thing. These are between 3 and 6 on their lifetime, and I'm keeping them at a uniform size of 30. Spawn rate is 2. And they are also moving infinitely. Some curl noise force, drag, sprite size is exactly the same as the particles, and then I have this vortex velocity. It's basically working the same way as this, except we're using these runes. And I'll show you how I set up the material for these. The most important part of this is we want this type of rotation. We want them to rotate around based on the normals of this shape location torus. So there's an invisible torus here that has normals, and we want the runes to rotate along the edges of this invisible torus. We don't want them to always be facing us. And how we do that is you need to come down to sprite render, make sure that you have your alignment set to custom alignment, facing mode, custom facing alignment, and you need to have this align sprite to mesh orientation. And you remember how I was talking about how particle update is happening after they spawn? Since this orientation needs to constantly be updated based on the normals of the torus, you need to come in here and you need to say that it's by shape location that you have here. So my shape location 0, 1, it's saying update to this, Make sure it's on the Z axis and the mesh orientation. This is going to make it so that at all times these particles are referencing this invisible torus shape location of where they spawned from, for which way should I be facing. Should I be rotating this way? Should I be towards the camera? It's very important for getting it to rotate correctly around the center. We don't want them to always be facing us. We want them to follow the normals of this torus. Again, same thing. Vortex velocity, point attraction force, and scale color. And that's their color. Cool. So I basically have the same thing for each of these. And these are there's a bit of randomness to them as they spawn. So you can see here, spawn rate, torus location. You can offset the torus of each of these if you want, as long as they're the same size. These are all spawning different ones, and it's very subtle. I'm just gonna turn this off so you can see all of them. Yeah, so you can see how these are kind of randomly spawning around here. There's the particles, and then 3 different runes are randomly spawning. Some of them are more easier to see than others. You can add as many as you want, or you can just add 1 or 2. And they're following the exact same thing. You could change their vortex velocity if you want some of them moving at different speeds. But again, the most important thing is this align sprite mesh orientation, setting it to the shape normals and the mesh orientation. And then sprite render, custom facing alignment, custom facing vector. For the particles, this doesn't matter because as long they're always just kind of looking the same. They don't need to be rotating around. That'd be kind of weird. So they're just so the main focus is just on these runes. So this is just copy and pasted 3 times, and all I'm doing is I'm changing the sprite render to be the rune, and I'll show you how I set that up. Welcome to the easiest material ever made. So all of this is particle color, and as you know, particle color allows us to change the color of things inside the Niagara emitter. So when we put down particle color, it just means, hey, I want to access this color inside the Niagara system. So, and then all I did here is put down a texture sample. You can just put texture sample, and then you just say right click, convert to parameter, plug that into the opacity so that you're controlling the color with the Niagara emitter, and then you can change what shape or what rune you're using in the material instance. So I'll show you that here. Here's an example. Here's a material instance, and all I did is change the rune here, right here. And you can see the parent is the one we're just looking at. So inside here, you can see I have 3 different runes, and these runes change, and you can make more of them, make less of them, whatever you want, but it allows us to easily iterate and add more runes to our Niagara system. To add that system to our blueprint, all you have to do is go to Components, Add Niagara Particle System Component. Mine is called Runes. I added the particle system here, and then once that's done, these runes and particles will begin spawning in our blueprint. The last thing for these runes is I want to be able to scale them all down at the end of this blueprint. So inside of the Niagara emitter, I created a user parameter called size, and I multiplied the scale sprite size by this parameter so that I can control this parameter from within my blueprint, and it'll affect all 3 of these runes. So if we go into our blueprint inside the event graph, at the very end, you can see that I have a timeline going from 1 to 0 over the course of 3 seconds, meaning these runes at the end will slowly basically scale down until they're not visible anymore. And then I'm just setting float parameter size, which is the one that we created inside our Niagara system. And then I brought the runes, which is obviously this, so the component. And that's it. So now all of those are set up within our blueprint. When the golden hero character starts out, he has the stones attached to his wrist before firing them. It's actually a different blueprint, which I'll show you now. I call it Stones Pickup EP because it was meant to be working as a pickup. All it is I'm having it after 4.5 seconds, which is when the hero tosses the stones. I'm having them delete themselves. And then on event tick, I'm setting up the rotation of the sphere. If you remember before, the sphere in the middle of the 2 stones, this one right here, will control the rotation of them, like this. So what you can do is I just set up a timeline, and this timeline goes from 260, 250 to 0, and this will control the rotation. So for every second, it's firing off a number, and this number is multiplied by the timeline by 1, and that's going into Z, which will control the Z of this circle, which is why we have this sphere here and not either of the stones. So now these will always rotate around when they're spawned. Now I'm going to talk about the hero character a little bit. So in the blueprint, as you can see, we're spawning the stones pickup, which is just those stones that are going to spawn onto his wrist. I have them being attached to the trail end socket on the skeletal mesh. So if you go to your skeletal mesh, you go to your mannequin, and you can see I have these sockets here. I copy the name, I bring that back, I put it into the socket name, and suddenly this blueprint is attached to his wrist. And then I'm playing these animations, and I'm just switching between two skeletal meshes to switch between the two animations in a kind of hacky way. And then for the spawn the stones VP, which is, if you remember, that's the main stones that causes pretty much everything to happen. The explosions and all the spinning and the going up into the air, that's all caused in the stones VP. And how I'm spawning that is I'm actually taking the logic that's inside the Unreal first-person shooter example, and I'm just copying and pasting that logic and bringing that into here. And then inside the stones VP, I actually set the velocity of the projectile to 0. So this is just copied and pasted logic for spawning a projectile, and I'm just setting the projectile to be my stones VP. And then the last thing that happens here is just those animations, and then setting the appear hero Niagara system, which I'll show you that here. It's just a simple like warping away or warping into effect. And all that's going on here is just two basically lines that like to zip back and forth between different areas. And it's very, very simple. Just spawn burst instantaneous, initialize particles. It's for 0.15 seconds. Uniform size is about 30. And then obviously I'm scaling the sprite size, so it starts off really tall and then eventually goes down to very, very small, about 0.3. And then for the X is also changing a little bit as well. The X is going from 0.2 to 0.1. So it's just changing just a little bit. And then scale color. These are my color settings, so we have a bit of a glow. And it's just the simple default sprite renderer. And for the other one, it's almost exactly the same. The only difference is the scale color is now a bit different. Or sorry, the only difference is the scale sprite size is a bit different. So we're going up to 20. So it's basically the reverse. It's a little bit of the reverse of what we had before. Except I guess we're starting at 0 here. And for the Y, we end up at 0. And we start out at 0.7. So 0.7 to 0. And then for the X, we have 0 to 20. And then once it's finished, just a little like zip effect. And then I also have this exactly the same for the enemies in my scene. And I'll go over the enemies and what they're doing a little bit later. But I'm just going to show you just to say like, hey, this is exactly the same thing. And then I'll show you the color values that I have. This is the only difference between these two. It's just kind of an animation to kind of set the powers of the world. Of they could do these zipping effects to go different places. One last thing is if you go to viewport and you see this sphere here, the only thing I'm using this sphere for is inside of the projectile spawn logic. I'm just using it to set the rotation of where I'm going to spawn my stones BP. So now let's go into the stones BP and I'll show you a couple more ways I've set things up. So now I'm going to show you how I created just about everything. On here I have this blueprint set up as a projectile, so I have this projectile movement. I have the velocity set to 0 because I don't want there, and also the bounciness set to 0 because I don't want this to bounce. I want this just to fall to the ground. And I don't want it to move a bunch. I want it to be basically dropped from the character once he does his attack. Then I have a sequence to split up different actions, and the first thing I have going on here is this raising the rocks. And I just have a sphere, which, as you remember, sphere controls both stones, and I have the runes, which is that Niagara emitter that I created. And in here I'm just setting it from -20 all the way up to 350, so that these stones slowly go up within the length of 2 seconds. Next thing I'm going to talk about is the rotation, and this rotation is set up pretty much exactly the same, very similar to the other one that I have here, except we are rotating in the Y and the Z, and they're rotating different speeds, and again the sphere to control both of the stones. And I kind of just did something that looks cool. I start out at 2 seconds, and then at 2 seconds we start changing to -4, which is going to increase the spin in the Z and the Y, and then eventually it slows down to 0 after 9 seconds. And these are both multiplied to give it a bit of a different feel, so the rotation in the Z is actually a bit faster than the rotation, or the rotation in the Y is a bit faster than the rotation in the Z. Next, I'm going to talk about the glowing lights. So as you remember, we had these point lights within our stone, and these are controlled basically the same way as all this other stuff that I've been talking about. These point lights are put in here, and then I have a timeline between 5.5 seconds, and at 2 seconds they are at 50,000 in brightness. So they are really, really bright over the course of these 2 seconds. Next, let's talk about the trails, which are basically, the trails are the swirling trails that go around the center. They go all crazy, and they are set in a location by the sphere, which is between both of our stones. So in the middle of these stones, these trails are spawning. I'll show you how I set this up. So here we have these crazy trails that are spinning around and around and around, and you'll see the first thing I have here is these. This is just simple spawn rate of particles. It's 3, and as you can see, it does nothing, and that is because these particles are simply used to generate the location of where I want this ribbon to be formed, which is the next emitter here. So I just have a spawn rate of 3, lifetime of 4.5, shape location sphere, so they're spawning in a big sphere, and the main thing that is important here is this vortex force, because there's a giant vortex that has a origin pull amount, meaning these are being in a vortex, but then they're also being pulled to the center very, very tightly with this number. And you can get some interesting results by playing around with these factors, and this will cause all these points to be going in these crazy different directions, but they're still pulled to the center, so they're not going to venture out too far from the center position. And then I also have a generate location event, and this is going to allow us to reference this location of these particles in this emitter. And then that's about it. These 2 things are the main important thing: the vortex force, the generate location event, and I guess the spawn rate. So you have 3 particles and the shape. So now let's get to where the magic is actually happening, which is a ribbon, and this ribbon is doing everything. What's happening here is it's spawning basically it continues to spawn a ribbon after these particles. So you can see I have initialized particles at 0.9 seconds, and then I have scale ribbon width starting at 1 and going all the way to 0, because I want these to get thinner as the longer they live. So at the very end, they'll basically be like nothing. Scale color, this is the color that I used for these trails. And then again, you need an event handler, and you need to say, hey, event handler properties, I want you to reference the location of these particles, and I want you to spawn based on these particles. And then receive location event. Yeah, these will allow us to take this location and spawn these trails. And I'll show you how I have these trails set up under the ribbon redditor. I just used master ribbon. So I'll talk about what I have here. It's simply this texture, and this texture is, I added some contrast, multiplied it, and it's going into the opacity. And then the main thing here is this radial gradient exponential, which is saying, hey, make a gradient, mask out the outside of this. That way there's no hard edge here. So if we didn't have this and it was just like completely flat on this side, then I would have like a hard edge when these are spawning, and it would look weird. So this spherical gradient exponential will give us a softer edge at the beginning and at the end. And then to get this like weird rotation, or this weird like where I'm moving the world position offset, I'm just doing that with a simple grass wind, and that's just going to give us some like weird windy kind of effects onto our trails. So you can see here that on these, it's kind of like they're moving a little bit, almost they're being drawn. And that's kind of the goal here when I was creating these, is I want kind of like, it almost looks like pen strokes or paint strokes as they're going along here. And then I have a particle color, so I can set what color I want this to be. So you can change this, and you can get different interesting results by using different noises, and then plugging it into your opacity, and then you can get interesting trails that are coming off of your Niagara emitter location event stuff. You'll notice in the effect that the stones actually have their own trails behind them. That's kind of a pinkish color. Let's see it here. These are just getting messed up because I'm pausing it back and forth. But you can see that these trails are very distinct from these. And how I set those up is almost exactly the same as how I set up trails 2, with this bluish color. The only difference is I'm not having any vortex velocity, and I'm not having any velocity from here. They're just kind of static. They have a simple point attraction force between 100 and 500. They're generating that location event again. I'm spawning 10 of them. and they're spawning just in a sphere. And their initialized particles are these parameters, and I have a little bit of drag on here. But if I play this, you'll see that nothing's really happening here. Let me pause this so you can see correctly. So you can see nothing's really happening here. These aren't moving. It's just all sitting here because there is no movement for the trails to follow. They're spawning these trails, but because there's no movement, they're all just sitting still in the middle. So what I've done is I've put those Niagara systems underneath each of the stones inside the blueprint. So as these stones are moving around and doing stuff, now these trails can spawn and it'll look like they have this movement. So I'll just show you my parameters. Again, it's pretty much exactly the same. A 5 ribbon width from 0.2 to 0. We're getting the location event, we're receiving the location event, and we're using the exact same material. So simply by putting these trails underneath these blueprint components, now they're following and creating more interesting shapes. They're following the movement that we've set up within our event graph.